everyone. If you are here for the Back to School and Eating Disorders webinar, you are most certainly in the right place. Welcome. So as everyone gets logged in, feel free to share where you're located in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Throughout the webinar as well, feel free to share your questions in the Q&A and chat section at the bottom of your screen using the host and a panelist section, just so we could keep everyone anonymous today. We'll be taking questions toward the end of the webinar as well, so you don't have to, so you don't want to miss out. Definitely don't want to miss out on this opportunity to send in the questions that you have. So we'll just wait a little bit for a few more people to log in. But yeah, in the meantime, please feel free again to share where you're from in the chat. Connecticut here. We're in Connecticut. We have someone here tuning in from Burlington, Vermont. Lovely, lovely. We have Northeast. Love to hear. Joining from CT as well. Brooklyn, New York. Fabulous, fabulous. New York. Another New York. Great. Great to hear. All right. So yeah, if you're here again for the Back to School and Eating Disorders webinar, you are in the perfect place. New Jersey, all right. We're still in the Northeast, but we love it. South Dakota, amazing. Wow, great to hear. Amazing. All right, well, now it's 12:05, so I think we should get started. So yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to this Balance webinar, Back to School and Eating Disorders, tips for students, loved ones, and school staff. So thank you for taking the time to log on today. Just by tuning in, you are putting energy toward learning about yourself and getting the support you or someone you know may need. So we are really happy to have you with us today. My name is Amanda Young. I am an intake coordinator here at Balance, and yeah, I'll be your moderator today. So just a little bit about Balance. Balance here is a premier eating disorder treatment center offering boutique outpatient treatment options using evidence-based practices to really provide customized and individualized care that best fits you and your loved ones in recovery. So as we move throughout today's presentation, please feel free to share any thoughts, reactions in the chat, like I mentioned. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them through the Q&A panel. I will make sure to keep a lookout so your questions are answered along the way. But again, we do have some time set aside for questions at the end as well. So we just ask again when typing questions, comments in the chat, please send them to the hosts and panelists option so we can keep any sensitive information private from others. All right, so as I mentioned, my name is Amanda Young. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an intake coordinator here at Balance. I'm actually a former educator, so this subject is really, really close to my heart. But now I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Korie Born, Balance's own intuitive eating, health at every size content creator, and a former master level educator as well. So Korie uses she, her pronouns and is a former educator turned intuitive eating counselor and content creator. She holds a master's degree in education, for which she studied the effects of eating disorders on academic success. So Korie's passion for eating disorder awareness and treatment spread to her classroom, where she helped her students build resilience around their body image and resistance to diet culture. So thank you so much for joining us today, Korie. We are so lucky to be here with you, and I will pass it on over.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. And thank you, Amanda, so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be here today and have this important conversation about how eating disorders in schools kind of overlap. So let's take a look at our goals for the day. First, we'll gain an understanding of how school is a high-risk time for eating disorder development. And when I say school, I'm particularly referring to high school and college, as this is where eating disorders are more prevalent, which I'll kind of touch on later. We will also talk about the potential that schools have, particularly school staff like teachers, professors, counselors, and administrators in fostering recovery. We'll talk through a way forward with recovery at the forefront during the academic year. I'll go through some practical tips for students to make this school year as recovery aligned as possible. You'll have the chance to engage with Balance experts for clarity and guidance during this back to school transition. And lastly, we will also give you tips for family, friends, and school staff to support recovery no matter what your role is. So before we dive in, I just want to touch briefly on why this conversation matters so much. The time that students are in school is a time when many people develop eating disorders or begin using eating disorder behaviors. And you can see on the slide, 2.3% of adolescents and a staggering 17.1% of college students develop eating disorders. So with these high numbers, it's really important to take time to really understand how eating disorders develop during the school years. And these school years are a time full of transitions, right? In and out of each academic year, from semester to semester, and even just from class to class. And these transitions can intensify eating disorder behaviors, particularly the transition from summer back to school, right? That's a big shift in kind of lifestyle from summer into school. And it can be quite alarming, going from the comfort of home for 2 months to being in a different environment for most of the day. Most importantly, even though eating disorders may be more prevalent during school and the back to school transition, there are steps that you can take, that anyone can take, to reduce the harm caused by eating disorders. So let's dive into it. As we start, I want to highlight all the people who impact how easy or difficult it is to prioritize eating disorder recovery in schools and kind of who's impacted. So first and foremost, the students that are struggling. While students with eating disorders might face the most pressure in terms of prioritizing recovery, they're also the ones at the center of, all the efforts that can be made to turn schools into safe spaces for people with eating disorders. Also, family and friends can have a profound impact on the development of eating disorders during school, but also on recovery. And lastly, educators play a huge role in affecting recovery in schools. That includes teachers, professors, coaches, aides, counselors, any adult working in schools in any capacity with students who might be struggling. Unfortunately, there is so little training available for school staff for eating disorder prevention and awareness. I'm speaking from experience here in my teacher education program, and throughout my years as an educator, I never once received a specialized training on how to help students with eating disorders. And that's alarming to me because, as we saw just a few minutes ago, quite a few students are affected by eating disorders. Luckily, we have some tips for you to start paving the way for recovery at your school, no matter what your role is. So, let's talk a little bit more about eating disorders in schools. So I'm going to ask if you could to tell me in the chat, again, to the host and panelist option, tell me about a situation in school. And when I say school, I mean school or college interchangeably, where you think someone's self-esteem might be affected. And I'm thinking positive or negative impacts. So what are some situations in college or school that might have impacted somebody's self-esteem? And as you're typing, I can share from my experience as a student, giving presentations in front of the class had a huge impact. I can think of so many times that I had a really excellent presentation, for a solo or group project, and I did well. And then I was like, oh, great, I feel great. But on the flip side, if I did poorly, or if I was nervous, or if anything went wrong, it had a detrimental effect on my self-esteem. Also things like, auditioning for a play. I was a theater kid, and every audition had a really huge impact on me. Whether it went well or whether it went poorly, it really just changed the course of the rest of my day and maybe even the rest of my week. I see someone in the chat said, when you're the last one to get picked on a sports team or in gym class, yeah, that's rough. And I mean, I've been there. That can really have a severe impact. I'm also seeing someone said, seeing other students and comparing body size to them or being convinced that everyone is judging your weight. That's real. Yeah, that can have a big impact on your self-esteem. Thank you for sharing. A couple more things came through. When you don't have a partner for a project in class, kind of like if a teacher says, okay, everybody pair up and work on this assignment. If you're the last one sitting there and everyone else is paired up, that can have a big effect, a negative impact on your self-esteem. If you have to present to the class by yourself, that's another thing. Yeah, standing up in front of a whole class of your peers and your teacher all alone is frightening. Then I see one more comment here. If a teacher calls out your performance on an assignment, good or bad, that extra attention has impacts on your self-esteem. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It really does. Even if it's for something positive, that extra attention feels like a spotlight when you're in school. I mean, especially I'm thinking high school or early college, that is, you kind of want to fly under the radar, but if a teacher's calling you out, it's kind of shocking. Thank you everybody so much for sharing. I just wanted to get us thinking about, some of the things that could possibly impact self-esteem. And we're going to move on to the next slide. And now that I've established that there are many ways that a person's self-esteem can be affected in school, let's shift to looking at how eating disorders can develop in schools as a result. So why is school so important when we consider how eating disorders develop? Well, students spend most of their time in school when they're not at home. And if they're in college, they spend even more time in a school setting if they're living on campus. And I know this might sound obvious. It felt obvious to me to say this, but when you actually think about it, the environment that a person is living in or spending their time in greatly affects their development. And because of that, we need to look at a school environment to see what happens there and what could potentially cause eating disorders or disordered eating. And within the school environment, there are so many factors that can impact students. Peers, teachers, coaches, social media kind of ramps up at school because especially nowadays, everyone's communicating via their phone, which is great, but it can also be detrimental. Thinking also things like athletics and other extracurriculars, all of these things can impact students' self-esteem and as a result, their body image. You might be surprised to see that teachers could impact a student's body image, especially if they're teaching a subject completely unrelated to bodies or food. But in my experience in education, students are like sponges and they are really listening. This means that if a teacher is commenting on their own body, their own food choices, or that of someone completely unrelated, the student can internalize these comments and kind of, take them to heart, even if they're not being said directed at the student or about the student can kind of soak that in and internalize it, which can be potentially harmful. This ties into the question I asked before too. So just take a moment and think how many of the situations that I share could potentially impact somebody's body image. There were a couple that were directly related to body size or weight, which is a clear tie-in to body image. So it's important to note that these factors can have negative impact on body image and lead to eating disorders and disordered eating behaviors directly. And direct impacts like internal or external pressures to excel academically or athletically or socially. This can also lead to disordered eating or poor body image. Students also face a lot of pressure to belong socially and find their social group. And, socializing is arguably one of the more important parts of going to school for a student. They get to spend time with their friends, meet new people, engage with their peers. But there's also a lot of pressure to fit in and be part of a group, and that pressure can turn inward and impact their self-esteem and their body image. And on the flip side of fitting in, students can face bullying and social ostracization. And while bullying might not always be directly related to their body, these bullying behaviors might not target the physical aspects of a person. They can still really impact their self-esteem and self-perception. So I think it's also really important to acknowledge perfectionism. Nowadays, I bet you can think of at least one person who's a self-proclaimed perfectionist and a few others who you would describe as a perfectionist yourself. I would definitely describe myself in that way. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Perfectionism seems harmless, but the constant pursuit of perfection can have serious consequences on a person's physical and mental health. And students can see the pursuit of physical perfection as a way to seek acceptance. And, kind of the thinking is if I look quote unquote perfect, people will accept me. And that way of thinking can easily lead to disordered eating to maintain their perceived quote unquote perfection. And at the very least, it can have serious consequences for their body image. Speaking of body image, there are some developmental factors that can impact a student's body image. So humans go through these kind of different developmental shifts in their life, from self-awareness at about age 2 to self-comparison at about age 4, and then body size awareness at about age 5. And you might be wondering if this is talking about high school and college age students. Why am I talking about 2, 4, and 5-year-olds? That's because those developmental shifts have a lasting impact on a person's life beyond just those ages. They're going from simply being aware of themselves and their thoughts and their actions, their appearance, to comparing themselves to others, to noticing their size as a comparison to other people. And this natural development leads into later school years when there are even more social implications. And while it's rarely acknowledged, bodies and body discussions are present in almost every subject in school. There are depictions of bodies in art class, descriptions in books in English or history, and maybe even related like word problems in math about what somebody is eating or maybe even their weight. I've seen it. It's wild. And the fact that bodies are brought up in social and academic settings in school conditions students to constantly make judgments about their bodies and about the bodies around them, whether they're doing it intentionally or not. And taken at face value, this might not seem really problematic or like a big deal to think about, but paired with the high pressure from school and the near constant comparison happening in schools, eating disorders or disordered eating can definitely arise as a result. So at this point, I want to really solidify how much is affected by eating disorders. Eating disorders affect a person's physical health. And that might, again, seem obvious, but it's important to really reckon with the fact that depending on the kind of eating disorder or disordered eating behaviors used, a person's cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, neurological, and endocrine health can all be affected. And those are major systems in your body affected because of an eating disorder. And all of these effects can lead to cognitive impairment, which can make it difficult to do well in school. Also, mentally, eating disorders are often co-diagnosed with other mental health illnesses like anxiety or depression or obsessive compulsive disorder. And, these illnesses can make it really difficult to engage in school as well. And lastly, eating disorders affect a person's social development. And more often than not, people with eating disorders withdraw socially. And this withdrawal can lead to social isolation and just a hard time making and maintaining relationships in school. And as I just mentioned, school is really a time where being social is an exciting part of the day, and it's maybe a priority for students. And, this social development being affected by an eating disorder can make that really challenging. And these three realms or domains can also affect each other, leading to kind of like an endless cycle of negative effects as a result of an eating disorder. I want to take a look at how transitions can impact or exacerbate the development of an eating disorder and why school plays a part in this. So transitions in school mean a lot of things for students, right? I already mentioned this a little bit earlier, but so much is changing. They're settling into a new routine, probably a new wake up time, a different meal and snack time, and generally shifting to needing to be like engaged and like mentally on and connected with other people and ideas throughout the day, more so than they were during the summertime. This transition back to school also means seeing friends again, maybe for the first time since school ended for summer break, meeting new people, making new friends. And this can be exciting, or it can just be really anxiety provoking, depending on the social dynamics. And along with having different or prescribed times for meals, students also have to eat in a different setting than they're used to during summer. And I'm thinking particularly, think back to being in school and eating in the cafeteria. And I've had students in the past tell me that when you eat in the cafeteria, it's so uncomfortable because it feels like everyone in the room is watching you eat. And that's troubling. And if the student struggles with food and body image, that can be even more problematic to feel like you kind of have a spotlight on you while you're eating. It can even cause people to revert or turn to eating disorder behaviors as a result. Also, the available foods are going to be different from what they might be used to eating during the summer months. And all of these shifts in just when you can eat and what you'll be eating can really impact a person, especially if they suffer with disordered eating. And also, it's important to think about the fact that during lunch and throughout the day, peer discussions about food and bodies add to the stress of transitions for students. And these discussions are fairly normalized in social settings, talking about what you're eating or how your clothes fit or the way that you look, but they can make things challenging for students struggling with food or body image. Lastly, there's just an overall added pressure during the back to school transition that adds to the general stress during this time. Students face internal and external pressure to do well in their classes and sports and other extracurriculars, and also maintain a thriving social life. That sounds like a lot to manage. And overall, expectations are high, and these shifts can cause added stress for students during the back to school transition. So on the next slide, we can see that Transitions also affect families and school staff when considering how eating disorders come about in schools. So, some situational factors can come into play during this transition for family and school staff, such as parents and loved ones have less control over a young adult's life, whether they're in high school or in college. They kind of relinquish control during the school day about their students' routine, their food choices, their sleep schedule, their social and academic choices. There's really only so much that a parent can say or do to affect what their child does or doesn't do while they're not physically with them. And, when it comes to eating, that gets even more intense if there's disordered eating at play. It can be really hard to let go of this control and trust that your loved one is eating sufficiently and not using disordered eating behaviors during this transition. Also, as students transition from summer back to school, it's natural for them to spend more time interacting with their friends as opposed to their family. And this distance from your child can lead to some stress, understandably so, especially if your child has a history of disordered eating. And for school staff, transitioning back to school means learning the habits of a whole new set of students. Speaking from experience, this is really difficult. It can be overwhelming to learn the different things that make each student who they are and make sure you create a supportive learning environment for everyone because everybody has different routines, different things that make them who they are. And as a teacher, you want to make it a cohesive learning environment for everybody. But that transition back is really tough. You have to learn however many students are coming into your classroom, and that can be an overwhelming transition for you as well, especially if you learn that your students are struggling with disordered eating. And for teachers and other school staff alike, there's also this pressure of being a role model throughout the day. And I never want to insinuate that teachers take on a parent role or even a parent-like role, but they are the adults that students are spending most of their time around during the school day. And therefore, they can have a huge impact on how students behave and view themselves and how they view other people too. And lastly, kind of the ever present challenge for school staff is to balance academics with emotional well being. Especially since the pandemic, there's been added pressure on school staff to make sure that academic programs are really rigorous while also helping students build emotional resilience. And this is really hard to do, but it's an important balance to consider when planning for the new school year. So that's just another thing that adds to the tension of this transition time for school staff. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about transitions, let's take a look at how eating disorders and disordered eating behaviors can kind of manifest or show up in schools. So this is definitely not an exhaustive list, as eating disorders are different for everyone, and there's no way to tell that someone has an eating disorder just by looking at them. But that being said, there are some overt behavioral patterns to look out for on this back to school season. So changes in eating patterns may seem like an obvious thing to be aware of, but these changes can be really subtle and take place over time. Or if you are coming back after the school year and if you knew someone in the previous school year, you might notice a drastic change from one school year to the next. Or maybe as the school year starts, you might notice shifts and ebbs and flows in their eating pattern as the school year progresses. But that's definitely something to keep an eye out for as we head back to school this year. People with eating disorders also tend to withdraw from social situations, especially situations where food is involved. I'm thinking about, eating in the cafeteria, as I mentioned before, social events or dances where dinner is served. And, this withdrawal doesn't necessarily indicate an eating disorder, but it's worth looking into as it could mean that there are other mental health struggles happening there. Also, changes in a person's weight, both up and down, can indicate the presence of an eating disorder or disordered eating. And it's important to remember that there's no one look to eating disorders and that people of all sizes can suffer from disordered eating. And last but not least, this is sort of aligned with social withdrawal. Someone with an eating disorder may show lower levels of engagement in academics, athletics, or other social activities. And this could look like scoring lower on assessments than anticipated based on past scores, or not participating in group projects, or just getting really tired really easy during a sports practice. These could all potentially be signs of an emerging eating disorder. Now, I want to, now that we've established why transitions are particularly challenging for people who struggle with food and body image and how eating disorders manifest in schools, let's talk a little bit about really why this matters. There are a lot of effects of eating disorders that directly affect a person's ability to do well in school. So, as I mentioned before, these illnesses take a mental, emotional, and physical toll, and they cause all around distress for someone who's struggling with an eating disorder. Specifically, the physical health effects of an eating disorder can lead to students missing school for medical appointments, for treatment, or other health related issues. If students miss school, their academic growth will almost certainly suffer as a result. And while I never would insinuate that their academic growth is more important than their physical or mental health, that's just something to take into consideration, like when we're talking about school. I also want to emphasize that these facts don't just go for people who have diagnosed eating disorders. People with undiagnosed eating disorders also face serious physical health effects. Sometimes, since without a diagnosis, it can be more challenging to seek treatment. That doesn't mean that undiagnosed eating disorders are not as serious. They're just as worthy and valid and as deserving of care as diagnosed eating disorders. And on the next slide, we can see there's even more health effects and other effects of eating disorders. So, how many times as a student have you been told to get a good night's sleep? Or how many times have you heard an adult or someone else in your life stress the importance of good sleep? I would hear it all the time, both as a student and as a teacher, like especially as a new teacher, so stressed and overwhelmed trying to make everything work at the back to school transition. Mentors would tell me, you got to get a good night's sleep. And I agree. But with an eating disorder, that becomes really challenging because eating disorders can often lead to sleep disturbances. And by that, I mean, it can be difficult to fall asleep, to stay asleep, and to get deep REM sleep. And this can impact a student's academic performance. It's really hard to do schoolwork when you're not well rested. And also, untreated eating disorders can result in lower GPAs. And while I know that the grade point average is not the defining measure of academic success for all students, it's a clear and measurable way to look at the impacts of an eating disorder on academic performance. It's also really important to look at how perfectionism plays a role in eating disorders. So we already touched on perfectionism concerning eating disorders and how commonplace perfectionism is. However, studies show that this seemingly positive trait impacts how likely it is that someone will develop an eating disorder. That's really important to remember when you're setting expectations during school, whether it's for yourself or for your students or for your family members. Is perfection the expectation? And if it is, just remember the impact that perfectionism can have. Oh, yeah, let's take a pause. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I know I just gave you a lot of information.
Yeah, Korie, we actually have one already. It says, what should I do if I think someone has an eating disorder? So, thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's kind of like the next section of this webinar that we're going to get into. But I can say the most important thing you can do if you think that somebody has an eating disorder is let them know that you are there for them and offer support. I would say just, indicating to them like, hey, is everything okay? Or offering support. They might not be ready to accept it yet, but you can definitely, make it known that you're a safe person to talk to about these things and just be in contact with them and be a support to them. And again, I have more specific tips on that coming up.
Amazing. And we also have someone who wrote in, how do I set boundaries with my friends at school around food and body conversations? That's a juicy one.
That is a juicy one. Thank you for saying it like that. Yeah, that's a really good question, especially, I keep mentioning how important the social element of school is for students. I think setting boundaries is really difficult, but it's absolutely possible. And I think that communicating from a place of sharing how someone else's behaviors are impacting you is a great way to go about setting boundaries because, it's not like you're not accusing them of anything. If you say, hey, I'm really impacted when you talk about changes in your own body, or I'm really affected when you make comments about the food that I'm eating. Using an I statement like that, really, it's not pointing a finger at anybody else. It's just sharing how you're feeling. And, your friends will want to support you and care for you. So if you share that the impact that it's having on you is negative, and then kind of ask for what you'd like them to do instead, for example, you could say, what if we just talked about the last movie we saw? Or what if we just talk about our weekend plans, or something shifted completely away from food and bodies? I think, sharing the impact it has on you and then proposing an alternative can be really helpful. I would also say, it's okay to like step away from the situation. That might be really challenging, but if you've set a boundary and it's not being respected, it's okay to say, actually, I'm not going to sit with you at lunch because I can't talk about food. Or, you don't even need to say that. You can just set that boundary by physically removing yourself from the situation. That's also an option.
Great, amazing. Thank you, Korie. And we also have someone wrote in, I have restricted my children's screen time at night. My child who has an ED wants me to turn off her screen time at night. What is your take on social media and sleep?
Thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. And I think that it's also really important I mentioned social media earlier, but social media, school, eating disorders, all kind of like are in this web together. And then when you bring sleep into the picture, all of it is impacted. My take on social media and sleep, just based on my experience as an educator and speaking with parents who ask similar questions, what do you think we should do? Should we take their phone away? Well, I'm not a parent. I can only speak from what I've read in research, and research does show that social media or the use of screens at night can really impact your sleep for the worst. So I personally am in favor of less screens at night, but ultimately you have to do what works for you and your family. I would also say, if social media is impacting your child's eating disorder, there are steps that you can take to make your social media feeds more positive in terms of fostering recovery and positive body image. And I certainly know that following balance on Instagram can help, and following other similar accounts that can kind of change your experience on social media to one that's more recovery focused. And I'm really sorry that that's kind of all having an impact. And I hope I answered your question. Oh, I also just got a really helpful message that said that there's also the well-being tab on a lot of phones that can like limit specific apps that might be triggering. So that's something worth looking into. Again, it's called well-being. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I think we can move on. What do you think, Amanda?
Yeah, I think we answered all the questions that have been sent in the chat. So feel free to keep them coming. We have some allotted time towards the end of the webinar. Off to you, Korie.
We have addressed some situations that can cause eating disorders in schools, how transitions can amplify this, and some ways that eating disorders kind of show up for students, like the signs and symptoms. Now, I want to go through some tips to make this back to school season recovery focused, and we'll start with tips for students who are struggling with eating disorders during school. So, the first and arguably most important tip is to reach out for support. And you can reach out to any person that you trust, a parent, a teacher, a professor, a counselor, a coach, any member of the school staff that you feel that you trust. This is an important step in making sure you get the help that you need. A great resource for students is the school counselor. You can always reach out to them with concerns about eating disorders or disordered eating for yourself or for your classmates. And, there might even be resources like support groups or tools that your counselor can help you join that are on campus. And if not, they can probably refer you to external sources like support groups or treatment programs or therapists to get you the support that you need. And I really don't want to downplay this step. It's really hard to reach out for help. But when asking for help, you don't necessarily have to be specific about all of your struggles and everything that you're going through. You can just say something like, hey, I'm having a hard time right now. And kind of just let that be your opening, and just let that be the way that you let someone that you trust know that you're struggling. This will signal to your trusted person that you're in need of support, and that way they can help you. That's kind of like the first step. Also, in general, it can be helpful to separate yourself from disordered patterns as they show up in the school day. So this can be conversations that you hear, comments that people make about you or about other people, or eating or exercise behaviors that you find triggering or problematic. And it's okay to remove yourself from these situations, even if your friends are engaging in these behaviors. And even if it means, as long as it means protecting yourself. So I already mentioned, a boundary can just be removing yourself from the situation, and that's okay to do. You can separate yourself by making a plan to be elsewhere, to eat in a different environment. I know I had students ask, hey, can I eat in your classroom? And that was okay with me. And that's something that's worth asking. If the cafeteria scene isn't working and if it's triggering, it's worth asking to eat somewhere else. Or you can just try to make an effort to spend time with friends that understand your values and your struggles as somebody with an eating disorder. Next, I would say practice self-care and make sure that your needs are being met. So when I say your needs, I mean your physiological needs, like getting enough food, water, and sleep. Back to sleep, it's still really important, but also engaging in some form of a self-care practice to protect your mental health. And at the end of the day, your health, both physical and mental, is the most important thing. Even in school, it's more important than any way that you'll score on anything academic. And it's definitely worth prioritizing. And you can practice self care by developing a mindfulness practice or a gratitude practice, by journaling, by taking a few deep breaths when you feel yourself getting overwhelmed. That is just the simplest way. My personal favorite way to engage in a self care practice, it's so simple. It's called 2 feet, 1 breath. You feel both feet on the ground and take a deep breath. And that has calmed me down so much. It sounds really silly and really like it wouldn't do much, but I do that anytime I'm feeling stressed or overwhelmed, and it always helps me out. And lastly, kind of to go back to that wonderful question we got in the chat, you can voice your boundaries with your friends and establish that you don't want to discuss what you or anybody else is eating, how they look, or anything that could trigger disordered eating patterns. And, a support system can make it easier to practice setting these boundaries. If you have supportive friends or a supportive adult at school that can help you practice like sharing and setting these boundaries or shifting conversations or removing yourself. And it's really hard to advocate for yourself, but it's definitely possible with practice and support. So next, let's take a look at some tips for loved ones, particularly for friends and family of students who might be suffering from an eating disorder as we head back to school. So I want to start off by just, I really wanted to break it down and start by saying, if you notice something, what do you do? So noticing that someone you love is struggling is so challenging and overwhelming, but you might even be left wondering what to say or just where to begin. And it's hard to have these kinds of conversations. It's difficult to be vulnerable for you and for the person who's struggling. So I tried to really simplify an approach that you can take to bring up your concerns. Um, the first step is to just let your friend or family member know that you're concerned. I have some suggestions on the next slide, so I'll show you in just a minute. But you can even just say, "Hey, are you okay?" Just something as simple as that is totally fine. Once you've voiced your concern, the next step is really to just listen with compassion. And you may have guesses about what's going on or how this person is feeling, but at this stage, it's most important to just really listen to what your loved one has to say without judgment and really just hear what they're saying and kind of put aside any narratives you might have in your head about what's happening for them and hear their perspective. And the third thing you can do is to offer support. And I want to be clear again that they might not be ready to accept help, but your offer is crucial. They might look back and this might mean the world to them. They might look back and recall that you were the first or maybe even the only person to communicate concerns, and that can be life-saving for them. And last, I really just want to emphasize that when you're voicing concern to someone who you think might be struggling with an eating disorder, it's more important to listen rather than talk. Voicing your concern, saying something very simple at first is a great first step, but then it's over to them to share what they're comfortable sharing so that you can hear the facts from them instead of guessing. So here are just some very simple examples that might not seem like much, but these things can work wonders in getting someone to feel comfortable opening up to you about their eating disorder. So they're very straightforward examples. So feel free to take a picture or a screenshot of this list to save for your own use, or maybe jot down the one that resonates most with you. So you can use it if you need to, or have it if you need to use it. So like I mentioned, hey, are you okay? You don't have to get more specific than that. If you do want to get more specific, keep it judgment free by saying something like, I've noticed you haven't eaten much lately. So notice that you're not assigning a positive or negative value to eating. You're just making a fact-based statement. You could also say, I see that your eating has been erratic. Again, not assigning any kind of morality or judgment to that, just making a noticing statement. I notice that your weight has shifted. It's important here not to make any kind of comments, despite the fact that, society loves to praise weight loss. It's important not to say anything about how good or bad you might see that weight loss. Just bring it up and say in a neutral way, I've noticed that your weight has shifted. You could say, I'm detecting that you've been hyper-focused on calories or weight. And this is something that a person with an eating disorder might feel really kind of protective about, or it might be something that they're hoping other people don't notice. But when you say that you notice this, you kind of open the door for them to share what that really feels like for them. And then last but not least, is everything all right? You don't have to say, is everything all right related to your eating or related to movement or anything like that. You can just ask if they're okay. That's totally fine. So notice how most of these are I statements. It's really important to come from a place of, compassionate concern and not place blame. And kind of like when you're setting a boundary, you can say an I notice without it being like a judgment or an accusation. And that's totally okay. So I wanted to pause and give you an opportunity to share in the chat to just the hosts and panelists again. Has anyone in this webinar ever been in this situation where you've had to bring up a concern about someone's disordered eating or eating disorder? What did you do? Feel free to share in the chat, and maybe what you did could help somebody else too. I see someone said, just listen to them to hear what would be helpful to them. Yeah, that's really important because everybody's different. Their needs are going to vary, and it's really important to listen to the person in front of you and do what's actually helpful to them, not what maybe you think might be helpful. Those things might be very different, so that could be a good idea. I see another response says to offer them new ways to engage in stressful times, like in food related situations. So yeah, I mean, that's a great idea. If you're at any kind of food focused event or like during lunch, you can offer them a way to, like participate in that event without the whole focus being on food. Maybe you could distract them or take them to a new location or, play a game, anything that would take their focus off of what they're eating or, yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, see one more. It says, work to understand their triggers and normalize them or not make a big deal about them. Yeah, that's a great idea. If you learn to understand the things that can be upsetting to a person with an eating disorder and not make a big deal of like avoiding or diverting the situation from those triggers, that can be really helpful too. I see another comment in here. When I first got my eating disorder in college, my RA brought in a local counselor to give us all a presentation on eating disorders. It helped me in an indirect way. That's amazing. That is so phenomenal. Your RA deserves huge props for that, because what a great way, maybe that's something that you can do is coordinate with people that work with whoever is struggling with an eating disorder to give kind of like an indirect presentation. So it's not like, hey, this person has an eating disorder, so let's do this presentation. Instead, it's like, hey, this is something that we could all stand to learn more about. So that can benefit everyone. So thank you so much for sharing. That's really wonderful. Now, so I've talked through a little bit about compassionate communication for friends and family. Now, here are some just straight up tips for friends and family. If they notice that a friend or family member has an eating disorder, is demonstrating disordered eating behaviors. So for friends, it's crucial to examine your own beliefs about food and bodies. So kind of, be aware of your views on these topics and be careful not to share thoughts or beliefs that could contribute to a disordered view of food or bodies. Especially when you're, heading back to school, this transition time is already full of stress, and it's an opportunity to shift the focus away from outward appearances and onto how your friend may be feeling. We've talked a little bit about perfectionism so far, but just to go back to that, I want to highlight that it's important to be aware of traits of perfectionism in your friends. So remember that even though perfectionism is often rewarded, it can lead to serious consequences, even if people are holding themselves to high standards all the time. In addition to being aware, it can help to normalize just talking about setting realistic expectations for yourself, for your friends, or just maybe even how hard it is to do that. And my next tip is to make time for self-care with your friends. Heading back to school is such a busy time as everybody settles back in, into their new routine and gets involved with extracurriculars. But if you can build self-care practices into the time you spend with your friends, it can go a long way in preventing disordered eating behaviors and building resilience. And this doesn't have to be anything elaborate or detailed. It can be, you could just recommend a skincare night or recommend a movie night or say, hey, let's go for like a gentle walk in the park or something like that. Anything to get them out of their mind and feeling more mindful. So for family members, all of the tips for friends apply, but there are some more specific tips that are just for family. So it's important to remember that eating disorders are inherited. So 70% of eating disorders are inherited from a family member. That being said, these are mental illnesses that run in families, and it is nobody's fault. Eating disorders kind of, hijack the brain, and it's unfair to blame the person who's struggling. If you have a history of an eating disorder or disordered eating, be proactive in discussing this topic with your loved one and to break down the stigma and encourage open communication about their body and their food intake. It's also important to examine expectations in the family culture around academics. Maybe you're a family that values high levels of achievement and demands or expects nothing but the best, and that's okay, but just be aware of how this impacts this kind of family culture impacts people. And last but not least, we recommend proactively and compassionately addressing your concerns, and just as importantly, making time to listen. If you notice behaviors that you're worried about, don't hesitate to bring them up with your family member. It can be really uncomfortable, but it can be life-changing. And once you bring up a concern, be sure to make the space to listen. Again, listen rather than talk. And listen, and by listening with empathy, you can show your loved one that they're safe to voice what's going on for them. It's for school staff as we head back to school. So these tips apply to teachers, professors, aides, counselors, admin, coaches, anyone interacting with students during the school day. So the first tip is for staff to be mindful of how you speak about food and bodies, right? Some positions in schools kind of lend themselves a little bit more naturally to talking about food and bodies, such as health teachers or PE teachers or coaches, or if there's like a cooking class. But all school staff can be more mindful about how they discuss food and bodies. And this includes comments that you make about your own body and about other people's bodies and any moralizing statements about them. If there are students in the room, they're probably listening to what you're saying, and you never know what kinds of comments will stick with them. Something else you can do as school staff is to seek training and resources about eating disorders. There are some organizations that provide eating disorder specific training to school staff, and this can help the staff as a whole kind of understand and help prevent eating disorders. And they're not often spoken about, right? There's a huge stigma and like this taboo about talking about eating disorders. And I don't think in my experience as a teacher or a student, anyone ever talked about eating disorders. But by taking the initiative and pursuing training for yourself or for the entire staff, you can really start to, demystify eating disorders on your campus. If you're not able to seek any formal training for yourself or for your colleagues, you can do some research on your own to learn about eating disorder signs and symptoms. And once you know what to look for, you'll be better equipped to have conversations with students who you think might be struggling. And Balance has lots of resources on our website and on our Instagram account about spotting eating disorders and tips for recovery. Our team can also help by hopping on a call with students with any questions that you have about thinking about treatment or navigating those struggles. So school staff can also refer to Balance, which is a great option. Next, this might be easier said than done, is to increase size representation in your materials. And this includes posters, instructional aids, things on the walls and presentations, and wherever possible, like diversifying the books and the materials that you use in the classroom. And the goal is to show a wide range of people and experiences, and this will help normalize all kinds of bodies for your students. You can also see what supports already exist on campus. Maybe there's a best practice established for students with eating disorders, whether they need to miss school for treatment or not. So you can check with your admin or your school's counseling department to see what kinds of practices already exist. If you have a student with an eating disorder, it's also really important to stay in contact with those students and their family, especially if they're missing school for treatment or for any other complications. You can also advocate for your students. This might look like reaching out to counselors for them, connecting with their families, or being there with them when they try to talk to other adults or peers with whatever they've been going through. If you're a student's trusted adult on campus, you can advocate for them by talking with your colleagues confidentially to make sure a student's entire teaching team is on the same page to best support them. And last but not least, try to be as flexible as possible with assignments and due dates. I know that teachers have our own deadlines, but the more flexible you can be with a student struggling with an eating disorder, it can be incredibly difficult to, manage treatment and school at the same time. So to the extent possible, try to allow each student to complete their work at a time or in a different capacity where they can still demonstrate their learning. So my last slide here, it says key themes and prevention, and this comes from a study looking at the themes that really helped prevent eating disorders in public schools with outside supports. So the first is increased awareness. So if you're talking and thinking about eating disorders, you're increasing the awareness about them. The next is offering support and recovery, whether you are a family member or a school staff member. Then family involvement, keeping the family involved in all of the happenings for the students struggling with an eating disorder. And then lastly, providing resources for anybody that's struggling. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to go over our resources.
Great. Thank you so much, Korie, for that overview of eating disorders in schools. Your work, time, effort, energy does not go unnoticed. So, with that said, I just wanted to take a moment to share some resources that can really help during this time of transition. So, first up, we have the Balance blog. It's full of resources for anyone affected by eating disorders. Blogs are posted weekly and they are a great resource for the back to school season and beyond. So, yeah, next up, we also have the National Eating Disorder Association. They have great resources for not only those struggling with eating disorders, but also for school professionals. And then we also have the Body Positive, which is an amazing nonprofit organization who developed a curriculum for educators to become more body positive and change school culture. Yeah, they have so many resources to really help you through the back to school transition over there. And then lastly, we have our Balance Instagram as well as Redefine Wellness Instagram, Mulaney Rogers Nutrition Instagram for inspiration, support, and recovery tips. So feel free to take a screenshot of that to find some additional resources. All right. All right, well, now we will take some time to answer the last of our questions here. We might not have time for absolutely everyone, but we will get to those that we can. So let's see here. Okay, great. Yeah, so the first question we have, Korie, how can I maintain a balanced, nourishing diet with meal plans and limited food options in my school cafeteria?
That's a really good question. And I know that from experience, maybe I'm thinking about my college experience, maybe the cafeteria options aren't great, or maybe they're pretty limited or not what you're used to eating to, prioritize your recovery. I would say see if you can get an advanced copy of the menu that'll be available that can really help you plan and make sure that you're hitting your meal plan goals. Also, just talking to the school and see if there's any flexibility there. And see, just get as much information as you can to be as prepared as possible. And I'm a huge advocate of always packing snacks. So if you're not able to learn about what the food options will be, make sure you're coming to school prepared with enough food to nourish and sustain you throughout the rest of the school day.
Great, amazing, perfect. So we actually have one more. How can I approach my teachers about my eating disorder?
That's a good question, and it's really difficult. So I just want to send compassion to the person that asked this question. And thank you for asking it. Um, Talking to a trusted adult is really hard. And I'd say the first step is to find that person on campus that you feel the strongest connection with, the person that you feel that you trust the most. That will automatically kind of, lower the stakes a little bit if you have a relationship with them already. And I would just say, as I mentioned earlier, you can just say something like, hey, I'm really struggling, or I think I might have a problem with food, or something just simple and vague like that can signal to them that you're in need of support so that they can take the next steps and offer you the support you might need.
Amazing. Great. Thank you, Korie. And just to piggyback off that question, we also have someone who wrote in, how can I find that trusted adult to talk to in school? If you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a challenge, from experience as a student. It's hard to know, what adult can I trust? How can I know that they're not going to just turn around and tell my family? How can I know that they're not going to tell all the other teachers? And, there are things in place to protect you in schools. So there are certain things that, of course, school staff will have to tell other adults about, but you can kind of establish who feels most like safest or most comfortable for you to talk to. Maybe it's a teacher whose class you love, or maybe it's a coach who's really helped you excel in whatever sport you play, or maybe it's your academic counselor or your guidance counselor. All of these people are great options, pretty much anyone that you have a relationship with. And, you can kind of develop that relationship too. And, school staff really want to help their students succeed. So I think it'd be hard for you to go wrong in choosing an adult on campus that would be willing to support you and help you find the care that you need.
All right. Well, it looks like we are coming to the end of our time here. So, again, I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you, Korie, again, for taking the time to really discuss these helpful strategies with all of us during this transition. So, now I just want to make sure I am sharing a few resources directly from us here at Balance as well, because we know transitions, particularly back to school, are very challenging for everyone. And you definitely do not have to navigate this time alone because support is available for students, loved ones, and school staff. So, yeah, to provide a bit of a summary of what we do here at Balance, we offer 5 tiers of programming that provide the opportunity for the most seamless road to recovery. So, our new program that we're actually launching this fall is the Fall Transition Daytime IOP. It runs Monday through Friday to offer you support during the day without sacrificing evening commitments. Then we also have our day program known as the PHP or Partial Hospitalization Program, our weekday evening, or our IOP program, which is Intensive Outpatient Program. And then we also have a Saturday program as well. And then, of course, we always have our groups and individual services for one-on-one support. Yeah, whether you would like to engage in our free support groups, we can have a consultation call or book an assessment. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We will place the links to book a call with us in the chat, or you can feel free to just simply text or give us a call. Our phone number is 646-631-3771. But again, thank you all so much for stopping by. We are so very honored you chose to spend this time with us. We hope you enjoyed this webinar as much as we did. To create it. So if you want to continue learning about recovery, eating disorders, or treatment, there are lots of opportunities, again, to get in touch with us. Please make sure for an individualized conversation, reach out for a free consultation call at the link provided in the chat, and we can answer any questions you might have about disordered eating and recovery. Also, be sure to keep an eye out, almost forgot, for our emails where we share lots of exciting announcements and free resources like our webinars and free support groups. Our next free support group actually will be on Saturday, September 9th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time with Balance's founder and CEO, Melanie Rogers herself. Thank you again, Korie, for the insightful and fantastic presentation. Again, your energy and efforts don't go unnoticed over here. So with that said, happy Friday. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we will see you all again soon.